Hello and welcome back to my studio. It's Lois here from Lois and Morgana Davidson Art, and today I'm going to be showing you how I painted this beautiful Scottish Highlands scene. I've painted this before. It's inspired by a photograph from Pixabay, which I shall link to in the description below if you're interested in taking a look at it. This is the photograph that I've been inspired by, and I always like to simplify this down quite a lot. I think it's a great one for beginners to try, as the building shapes are nice and simple and we can remove the more complicated shapes and still leave a nice group of buildings. And of course, for intermediates, you can include as many of the other buildings and features as you like. I'm not painting the boats in this one today, but of course putting them in will really enhance the scene and add complexity. But before we get into the demo, just a quick plug for my new book, Landscapes in Watercolour, Techniques and Tutorials for the Complete Beginner. It's available to buy from all good bookstores or to pre-order in the USA, but I think it's out on the 2nd of July. Right, let's get back to the demo. As always, the first thing to do is to sketch the scene out lightly in pencil, making sure you don't press too hard because then you can erase anything that doesn't quite work out right. Keep your drawing sort of accurate but light and sketchy. This way I'm creating a roadmap for my painting in pencil. I can make adjustments and erase as I need to until it looks right. Then I'm going to go over it with waterproof fine liner. I'm using a Faber-Castell Artist Pitt pen, size 0.5 or fine, and I'm just going over my outline, still keeping loose and sketchy, creating more detail and definition around the cottages and trees and bushes, and a lot less definition in the mountains and the foreground. This will keep the viewer's attention on my point of interest, which is of course the buildings and the trees. The colours I'm going to be using today are cobalt blue, ultramarine blue. Both are good mixing blues as well as good sky blues, both granulate, and I'll be using Payne's grey for most of the sky. I'll show you how these three colours sort of play together, and this will give you an idea as to why I use these colours. If I use more blue and less grey, I'll get a much brighter summer sky, but I'm looking for this sort of cloudy, stormy sky. And I may or may not use neutral tint today. I'm thinking that neutral tint, because it's got a sort of a violetish hue, as opposed to Payne's grey, which has a bluish hue. So here's neutral tint, both painted out strongly and painted out more diluted. Then I'll be using sap green, raw sienna, raw umber. I'll be using some burnt sienna, and I'll put out a little bit of alizarin crimson. I'm not sure if I'll be using it, but it makes quite a nice sort of neutral shadow colour along with ultramarine and neutral tint. So those are the colours that I'll use. I shall put those all out on my palette and just mix freely from them on the palette and on the page. So I'm going to start off by painting the sky and the loch wet in wet. I'll bring the water using my large wash brush over the mountains as well, but be careful to cut around the cottages because I want to keep those the white of the paper and just introduce a tiny bit of colour to them at the end, but I don't want them to be covered with the sky colour. So just carefully wetting around them, because of course when we paint the wet in wet sky wash, the paint will resist the dry areas of paper. So starting off with some raw sienna, very weak, just to add a little bit of tone. That should just give me a little bit of extra glow to my shadows. Then this is Payne's grey, sweeping the Payne's grey across the page, keeping it darkest across the top, leaving gaps for clouds. Although I don't need too many sort of pale clouds in this one, as I want quite a moody, stormy sky. And here's my cobalt blue and ultramarine kind of mixing on the page with the Payne's grey, darkening up the top a little bit. Working quickly, wet in wet, so that all these colours will diffuse softly together. Today I'm using Saunders Waterford cold press watercolour paper. It's taped to my board, and my board's at an angle of about 20 to 30 degrees, so gravity is of course helping with the painting. So the wet process, everything is softly diffusing in my sky and sort of colour blending on the page. I want to add some of that sky colour across my water. Maybe sort of lift a little bit out here and there very quickly with a damp brush. Don't use any wet brushes in your sky at this point, otherwise you'll create some cauliflower marks. So keep any additions drier than the sky mix. And while things are still wet, I'm going to introduce this sort of violety grey colour across the mountains. So that's alizarin crimson, ultramarine blue and neutral tint. And now mostly using these earthy colours and the sap green and a little bit of dark here and there, I shall build up my ground plane around the cottages, the trees and the beach. I'm using the tip, the corner and the belly of my brush. It's very important to get used to your brush when you're working with big brushes. Try and learn to use different parts of the brush to get different brush strokes, and then you can paint in a way that adds variety to your brush strokes and of course interest to the painting and the textures that you're creating. I'm using my palette knife to scrape through the rich paint in the foreground and the midground in places. This scrapes through the paint to reveal the white of the paper or the layer of paint below and gives me added texture and suggestions of detail or something and nothing. I can also use the tip of the palette knife to scrape through that rich paint in the trees, which just gives me a few highlights along with the darker tree trunk marks created with the fine liner at the beginning at the Linework stage. I can go back in with a few darks in and around the areas that I've created with the palette knife, just to add in a few more deeper shadows and extra texture. If I zoom in, I can show you some of the slightly finer marks that I'm creating here in the middle ground around my point of interest. And then when I feel I've got enough of these little scraped marks, I'll go back in with my dark colour and work around them a bit for shadow. This is my 3/4 inch flat brush. And I'm quite happy with that for the first stage. I'm now going to leave it all to dry completely and then come back and finish the painting. So it's all nice and dry, and the next thing to do is to carefully paint around the trees and the cottages and get a nice dark covering for this closest mountain. For this I'm using my size 14 Escoda Perla, and I'm going to be using my mix of alizarin crimson, ultramarine blue and neutral tint, but this time with a bit of Payne's grey and a bit of cobalt blue mixed into it. Notice the difference here, painting wet onto the dry painting, so the wet on dry technique. The paint is staying where I put it, and I can really carefully work around my trees, negatively painting around the canopies just to add a little bit of shape to them. I'm going to bring this mountain carefully down along my penciled in horizon line, where I penciled in just a little bit of dark across the border of the loch. Feathering this mark out so it becomes nice and thin, a nice gentle slope at the edge of the loch. I think I'll come across from this side and then get the two marks to meet in the middle. That way I should keep a nice straight horizon. And then once I've done that, I'll paint the large mountain behind, keeping it nice and dark, but keeping a little bit of differentiation between the edge of the loch and the mountain itself. This is the same colour thinned out with a bit more water to create a much lighter value. This will give me some aerial perspective as my far distant mountains appear to recede into the distance. And now going back to my 1.5 inch modeler brush, introducing some of that shadow colour across the foreground, just to bring in some of those sort of heathery colours, some cloud shadows, and also some darker values here and there, as I say, just to tie this lighter underpainting together. Now I'm using a small flat brush and applying a very pale wash of ultramarine blue to the cottage walls. This will still give them the appearance of being little white cottages, but the ultramarine blue gives them a lovely sort of glow and incorporates them into the landscape a little bit more, if you see what I mean. I can increase the value of that colour on the left of the cottage for some darker value. And I can add a little tiny bit of the neutral tint or the violet colour to that grey for a really nice classic Scottish stone or slate roof. Maybe a bit of shadow on to knock this distant cottage back a little bit further. And now with a small calligraphy brush, once the walls of the cottages have dried, I can paint in some shadows using that nice dark colour that I used for the mountains. One on the wall and then one on the roof. And I think that really draws the eye now. The shadows are a nice finishing touch here. Just drop a few more darks in here and there while I've got that shadow colour. And then step back and sort of assess it. And I think I need a little bit of slightly different texture in the foreground. So I've placed a piece of paper over the cottages and the sky to protect them. And I'm using my fan brush just to spatter a few dots into the foreground, just to break up that texture in a very subtle way. So I'm going to call that finished. I'll remove the tape and see how it looks with its clean white border. This lets us see it with fresh eyes, and sometimes we then see we need to make adjustments. But today I'm quite happy with this as it is. And I'm hoping that those of you, especially beginners, will be able to see the relationship between the colours that I've used. Some of them you can see in their original form, but you can see a lot of the others have either been mixed on the palette or have been mixed on the page and have produced quite a wide variety of hues and values. Thank you very much for watching. If you found this interesting or helpful, then please click on the thumbs up button. And if you aren't already subscribed to our channel, then I invite you to do so. It's free to do and it really helps us with our reach, and we'd love you to become a part of our artist community here on YouTube. And thank you so much to everybody that supports us on Patreon. We really couldn't run this channel without you. I'll see you again soon. Take care and happy painting. Bye.